Natural rocks don't hit the brakes, but the 3i Atlas shows some strange behaviour near Jupiter. They don't pick destinations. They don't execute precision manoeuvres across millions of kilometres of darkness to arrive at specific targets with timing that defies statistical probability. But as we speak, as you're watching this right now, 3i Atlas is doing exactly that. On March 17th, 2026, mark that date, write it down, set a reminder. This interstellar visitor will reach Euphemy, a tiny 2-kilometre moon buried deep within Jupiter's orbit. The math says this is impossible. The physics says natural objects can't do this. The CIA says the details are classified under protocols from 1947. And the mainstream scientific establishment says it's just coincidence, just weird physics. Just another anomaly in a growing list of anomalies that we're supposed to accept without asking the obvious questions. Hit like and subscribe for more sleepy explanation. I'll be honest with you right now before we go any further. I'm not buying it. None of it. This isn't a flyby. This isn't random drift through the void. This isn't a comet following gravitational dynamics with some unusual sublimation, creating slight trajectory perturbations. This is a rendezvous. This is arrival. This is navigation. The 3i Atlas approach to Jupiter is no accident. It's deliberate. It's controlled. It's exactly what you'd expect if you were watching spacecraft executing planned trajectory rather than watching rock responding passively to forces acting upon it. And we, humanity, the scientific community, everyone who's been watching this object, are the only ones left in the room still trying to call it a comet. What gets me, what keeps me awake thinking about this, is how much energy is being spent to keep us looking the other way. How much effort goes into maintaining the "it's just a comet" narrative, despite mounting evidence that challenges that explanation at every turn. How quickly observations get classified or downplayed or explained away through increasingly contrived natural mechanisms that require stacking special circumstances on top of each other until the explanations become more implausible than just admitting we might be observing something artificial. I can't shake the feeling that we're witnessing the single most important event in the history of our species, first contact with technology from beyond our solar system, and yet the official narrative is as dry as a textbook, as careful and neutral and deliberately boring as bureaucratic language can make it. Before we dive deeper into the physics and the timing and the implications of what's about to happen in March 2026, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Because what we're documenting here isn't just interesting astronomical observation. This is potentially the moment when everything changes. When humanity has to confront that we're not alone. When the silence of the cosmos breaks and we have to accept visitors that didn't ask permission before entering our solar system. And if you want to be here when that moment arrives, if you want to follow this investigation as the evidence accumulates and as March 17th approaches, and as we track whether 3i Atlas actually does what the trajectory predicts, you need to be subscribed, hit that button, enable notifications, give this video a like because the algorithm needs to know that people care about these questions. This matters more than anything else that's happening in the world right now, if even half of what the evidence suggests is true. 3i Atlas has been breaking the rules since the day it entered our solar system. Since the first observations that identified it as interstellar visitor rather than long-period comet from our own Oort cloud, it has shown non-gravitational acceleration, velocity changes that can't be explained through sublimation alone, trajectory adjustments that look like course corrections rather than like passive response to solar heating, creating asymmetric outgassing. It's carrying chemical signature that doesn't match what natural comets display. Specifically, an abnormally high nickel-to-iron ratio that suggests industrial origin rather than primordial accretion from protoplanetary disk. And now it has a target, a specific destination, a precise arrival date at specific moon that requires exactly the kind of navigation that spacecraft execute, but that natural objects don't. We're talking about precision maneuver toward the Jupiter Hill sphere. That's the invisible gravitational boundary where Jupiter's influence becomes dominant over the Sun's. It's the edge of Jupiter's domain, the line past which you're in Jovian space rather than in solar space. And 3i Atlas is skimming that boundary with 0.1% margin of error. The Hill sphere radius for Jupiter sits at approximately 53.5 million kilometers from the planet's center. The predicted closest approach for 3i Atlas is 53.6 million kilometers. That's 100,000 kilometers difference. That's 0.19% error margin, That's threading a needle across interstellar distances. If you were driving a car at 100 miles per hour and you managed to park it perfectly in a garage you've never seen before, in darkness, without GPS, people would call you a master driver. They'd recognize the skill involved. They'd acknowledge that precision requires control and intent and planning. When an interstellar object does the equivalent across millions of miles of space, after traveling for who knows how long through the galaxy, we're told it's just physics, just gravitational dynamics, just natural orbital mechanics producing coincidental precision that happens to look exactly like navigation, even though calling it navigation would require admitting implications we're not ready to accept. But I don't know if that explanation holds up under scrutiny. The more I examine the numbers, the more I study the trajectory, the more I compare what 3i Atlas is doing to what natural objects do, it feels less like physics and more like intent. Less like passive response to forces and more like active guidance toward chosen destination. And that distinction, between physics and intent, between natural and artificial, is exactly what we're grappling with as March 2026 approaches. We're moving toward a threshold that changes everything. If 3i Atlas enters stable orbit around Jupiter, if it doesn't just pass through the system on hyperbolic trajectory, but instead gets captured and remains, it becomes Jupiter's 96th moon. A moon that wasn't there yesterday. A moon that came from another star. A moon that chose to stay rather than being randomly captured through the vanishingly unlikely process that would be required for natural object travelling at interstellar velocities to shed enough energy to be gravitationally bound. And if that happens, if we wake up on March 18th and 3i Atlas is circling Jupiter, rather than receding into deep space, we can't keep pretending this is natural phenomenon. Can't keep avoiding the obvious conclusion that requires less special pleading than the natural alternatives. Sometimes I think we underestimate how quiet the universe has been, how much we've come to rely on that silence to keep our sanity intact, to maintain worldview where we're alone, where the cosmos is empty of other intelligence, where we're the only ones looking up at the stars and wondering if anyone else is out there. That silence has been comfortable, has allowed us to explore and to theorize and to search without having to confront actual contact, without having to deal with reality of visitors who arrived without asking and who might have purposes we don't understand and capabilities we can't match. But that silence is about to be broken. The void is speaking. 3i Atlas is the message. And what it's saying through its trajectory and its timing and its precision is that we're not alone, and that the galaxy is more populated and more active than we've been assuming. That objects transit between stellar systems not just randomly through gravitational ejection, but potentially deliberately through technology that we're only beginning to recognize. That the solar system isn't pristine untouched territory, but is instead waypoint or destination or harbour, where visitors arrive and where they've probably been arriving for longer than we've existed to notice them. To understand why the March 17th rendezvous represents crisis of logic, rather than just being interesting astronomical event, we have to talk about the physics of the Hill sphere. It's a term that doesn't come up much in daily conversation. Most people have never heard of it. But it's the most important boundary in the Jovian system for understanding what has to happen if 3i Atlas is going to be captured rather than just passing through. The Hill sphere, also called the Roche sphere in some contexts though, technically those describe slightly different things, marks the edge of where Jupiter's gravity finally overpowers the Sun's gravitational influence. For planet as massive as Jupiter, for gas giant with 318 times Earth's mass and gravitational dominance extending vast distances into surrounding space, that boundary sits at roughly 53.5 million kilometers out from Jupiter's center. That's enormous distance. That's about 140 times the Earth-Moon distance. That's region where you're far enough from Jupiter that Sun's gravity is still significant, but close enough that Jupiter's influence is starting to dominate. And within that sphere, Jupiter's gravity controls what happens to objects, controls whether they orbit stably, or whether they get perturbed and eventually ejected, or whether they crash into the planet or into one of its major moons. 3i Atlas is on trajectory to cross that line at 53.6 million kilometers. It's practically dragging its wings on the fence. It's skimming the boundary with precision that looks deliberate rather than coincidental. And the closer you examine that number, the more you compare it to the Hill sphere radius, the more it feels like pilot choosing glide slope rather than rock tumbling through void. Because hitting that boundary isn't just about getting close to Jupiter. Any hyperbolic trajectory that passes near Jupiter will cross the Hill sphere somewhere, but crossing it at the precise distance where capture becomes possible, where the velocity and the approach angle are such that you could potentially be gravitationally bound, rather than just swinging past and heading back out, that requires specific conditions that random approaches don't typically satisfy. Now, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about boundary crossing, and about Hill spheres, and about orbital mechanics that most people will never need to understand? Because to stay within that sphere, to actually be captured and become moon rather than just being temporary visitor, an object has to slow down, has to shed velocity, has to reduce its kinetic energy below the threshold where it can escape Jupiter's gravity. And that's where the physics becomes problematic for natural explanation. Because if you're coming from interstellar space, if you're entering solar system from outside with velocity sufficient to cross interstellar distances in reasonable time, you're moving way too fast to be captured by planet. You're like bullet trying to be caught by piece of silk without tearing through it. You have momentum, you have energy, and unless something removes that energy, unless some mechanism extracts the kinetic energy that your velocity represents, you're going to swing past Jupiter and continue on your way. You're not going to settle into orbit. You're not going to become moon. You're going to execute hyperbolic flyby and exit the system just like Oumuamua did, and just like 2I Borisov did. That's what interstellar visitors do when they're natural objects following gravitational trajectories without any propulsion or control. But there's no air in vacuum to create drag. There's no atmospheric friction that could slow you down the way spacecraft experience when they use aerobraking to shed velocity in planetary atmospheres. There's no natural mechanism for object to suddenly dump its kinetic energy just as it reaches planet unless it's falling into direct collision, where the impact converts kinetic energy into heat and destruction. But 3I Atlas isn't on collision course, isn't aimed at Jupiter's cloud tops or at any of the major moons where impact would terminate its journey. It's aimed at the Hill sphere boundary, at the precise location where capture becomes possible if and only if velocity can be reduced. Avi Loeb, the Harvard astronomer who's been lightning rod for this entire discussion about interstellar visitors and artificial objects, argues that unless object is fragmenting in very specific, almost impossible way, where the fragments separate with exactly the right velocities to change the center of mass trajectory, the only explanation for stable capture is propulsion, is active velocity reduction through thrust, is braking, is exactly what spacecraft do when they want to be captured by planet instead of flying past it. You fire engines retrograde, you reduce velocity below escape threshold, you allow gravity to capture you into orbit instead of just deflecting your trajectory. And yet when we look at 3I Atlas, we see no huge plumes of gas, no traditional rocket exhaust, no obvious propulsion signature that would indicate chemical or even ion thrusters operating at scale sufficient to change velocity by amounts needed for capture. What we see is silent, ghostly adjustment, trajectory evolving in ways that look like course corrections, but without visible mechanism creating those corrections. That's what's so unsettling about this. That's what makes it feel less like natural comet and more like technology operating according to principles we don't recognize, or using propulsion systems that don't produce signatures we know how to detect. Of course, what really messes with my head, what keeps bringing me back to technological interpretation, despite all the training and skepticism that science instills about not jumping to extraordinary conclusions without extraordinary evidence, is the chemical signature. The spectroscopic data that reveals what 3I Atlas is made of by analyzing light, reflected from its surface, or emitted from its coma if it's outgassing. That data suggests something deeply anomalous, something that doesn't match what we see in natural solar system bodies, or even in the limited sample of interstellar visitors we've characterized. Specifically, 3I Atlas shows abnormally high nickel-to-iron ratio in natural objects, in asteroids and meteorites and planetary materials that form through accretion from protoplanetary disk. Nickel and iron go hand in hand, they're chemically similar. They condense together in early solar system, they alloyed together in planetary cores where heat and pressure allowed metal segregation. The ratio between them is relatively consistent across most natural samples because the processes that concentrated one also concentrated the other. You don't typically find nickel without iron, or iron without nickel in ratios that deviate dramatically from what primordial condensation chemistry predicts. But when you do find nickel by itself, or in concentrations that are much higher relative to iron than natural processes produce, it usually points to one thing: industrial refining. Human metallurgy, deliberate separation and purification of elements for engineering purposes, rather than natural geochemical processes operating blindly according to temperature and pressure and chemical potential. It's the kind of material you'd use to build hull of spacecraft that needs to survive thousand-year drift through darkness of interstellar space. That needs to resist micrometeorite impacts and radiation damage and thermal cycling and all the environmental stresses that long-duration space travel imposes. Nickel alloys are exactly what we use for high-performance aerospace applications, are what we'd choose if we were designing vessel for interstellar mission, and we wanted materials that are strong and durable and resistant to degradation over timescales that dwarf any human engineering project. Finding that signature in 3I Atlas doesn't prove artificial origin, doesn't definitively establish that we're looking at manufactured structure, but it's exactly what we'd expect to find if we were looking at manufactured structure. Is consistent with technological interpretation in ways that strain natural explanation. Some researchers have wondered whether the outgassing we've observed from 3I Atlas is actually high-efficiency propulsion system disguised as natural process. Whether what looks like comet sublimating volatiles as it approaches Sun is actually thruster operation. Whether the gas emissions that spectroscopy detects aren't just water vapor and carbon dioxide and other typical cometary species being released through solar heating, but are instead propellant being expelled to create thrust, while maintaining appearance that casual observers would interpret as normal cometary activity. That would be clever if true, would be camouflage, would be way to execute propulsive maneuvers while avoiding obvious detection that rocket plumes would create. Others push back, saying we just don't understand how comets behave in deep space, saying that our experience with solar system comets might not prepare us for how interstellar objects work, saying that composition and structure and outgassing patterns might be different for objects that formed in other stellar systems under different conditions, and that unusual chemical signatures and unexpected behaviors don't necessarily indicate artificiality. That extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that ambiguous observations shouldn't be interpreted as proving the most dramatic possibility when more mundane explanations might suffice, even if those explanations require acknowledging our ignorance about processes we haven't studied thoroughly. But here's what neither side can dismiss. Comets don't perform microcorrections after passing the Sun to hit targets millions of miles away. Natural objects on hyperbolic trajectories don't adjust their paths post-perihelion to aim at specific moons in outer solar system. 3I Atlas did. The trajectory data shows velocity changes occurring after closest approach to Sun, shows course corrections that altered the path in ways that brought Eupheme rendezvous from unlikely to probable to essentially certain if the object maintains current trajectory. That adjustment, that mid-course correction, that navigation, is what transforms this from weird comet with unusual properties to object under intelligent control. It made a choice, or something made a choice about its trajectory. And that choice is leading it directly into a cluster of the strangest objects in our solar system, the Ananka group. These aren't your typical Jovian moons like Io with its sulfur volcanoes, or Europa with its subsurface ocean, or Ganymede with its intrinsic magnetic field. These are irregulars, small, jagged, moving in retrograde orbits, meaning they circle Jupiter in opposite direction from the planet's rotation and from the orbits of the regular moons. It's like group of cars driving wrong way on highway, like objects that don't belong, like captured interlopers rather than native satellites that formed alongside the planet. The official explanation for the Ananka group's existence is that they're captured asteroids, fragments of rock that got too close to Jupiter during the early chaotic phases of solar system evolution, that happened to arrive with exactly the right velocities and approach angles to be gravitationally bound rather than being flung away or crashing into the planet, and that have remained in these peculiar retrograde orbits for billions of years since that capture occurred. It's plausible in principle. Computer simulations show that capture is possible under specific circumstances, but it's also statistically unlikely. Requires coincidental alignment of multiple factors, and when you have an entire group of objects all captured into similar retrograde orbits, rather than just one or two random examples, the coincidence starts feeling contrived. But here's the part that always gets me, that troubles me every time I think about the Ananka group, and about why 3I Atlas might be heading there specifically. We have almost no clear images of these moons. Despite all our missions to Jupiter, despite Voyager flybys and Galileo orbiter, and Juno currently circling the planet, taking spectacular images of cloud bands and auroras and the Great Red Spot, the Ananka group remains a collection of blurry pixels. We can measure their orbits through gravitational perturbations and through tracking their positions across time. We can estimate their sizes from how much sunlight they reflect. We can classify them as C-type asteroids based on spectroscopic signatures suggesting carbonaceous composition. But actual resolved images, detailed surface features, understanding of what they actually are beyond just being small dark objects in distant retrograde orbits, we don't have that. It's almost as if they don't want to be seen. As if there's something about these objects that resists observation. Now, I'm not claiming invisibility or cloaking technology or anything that violates physics, but I am noting that our exploration of Jupiter system has been comprehensive for major moons while leaving the irregular satellites largely unexamined. And that asymmetry might not be accident, might reflect conscious decisions about where to point cameras and where to allocate limited spacecraft resources and what targets are considered scientifically valuable versus what gets dismissed as just more captured asteroids that aren't worth detailed study. Take Euphemia specifically, its tiny speck, only 2 kilometers in diameter. That's roughly the size of Small Mountain. That's object you could walk across in an hour if it had solid surface to walk on, and if your spacesuit could handle the radiation environment and the vacuum. On March 17, 2026, just one day after 3I Atlas crosses the Jovian Hill sphere boundary, the interstellar visitor will make close pass to Euphemia. We'll approach to within distances that we don't know precisely yet because the trajectory calculations require updates as new observations refine the orbital elements, but that predictions suggest will be measured in kilometers or tens of kilometers rather than in thousands. Now ask yourself this question. Seriously consider it. Why would interstellar object, having travelled across light years of void, having crossed the galaxy or substantial portion of it over timescales we can only guess at, decide to dance with 2-kilometer rock that orbits backwards around Jupiter? Why would navigation, if navigation's occurring, target something so small and so obscure? If you were asteroid randomly captured by Jupiter, if you were natural object following gravitational dynamics, what's the probability that your orbit would bring you into close proximity with another captured object that's tiny and distant and part of sparse irregular satellite population? The probability is vanishingly small. Space is mostly empty even within planetary systems. Even within crowded regions like asteroid belt or Kuiper belt, objects are separated by distances that dwarf their sizes. Collisions are rare, close approaches are uncommon. For 2 objects to encounter each other requires either waiting for orbital evolution over millions of years to bring their paths into alignment, or requires deliberate navigation toward planned rendezvous. And 3I Atlas is executing that rendezvous not over millions of years but over months, is arriving at Jupiter and immediately proceeding to Euphemia encounter without spending eons in chaotic orbital evolution that might eventually produce close approach through chance. If you were looking for place to hide beacon or base or refueling station, if you were advanced civilization that wanted to maintain presence in solar system without being obvious about it, would you not pick precisely this kind of location? Would you not choose place that no one is looking? Place where orbit itself acts as cloaking device against natural flow of the system? Place that's categorized as just another captured asteroid and therefore dismissed as uninteresting by exploratory missions that have limited time and resources and that prioritize targets with obvious scientific value? I can't shake the feeling that the Ananka group isn't a cluster of rocks at all, that it might be a fleet of ancient dormant ships or stations or probes that have been waiting in Jupiter orbit for unknown duration, waiting for signal, waiting for visitor, waiting for activation that March 2026 might provide. That's speculation, obviously. That's interpretation that goes beyond what data strictly shows, but it's interpretation that fits the pattern. That explains why 3I Atlas would target this specific location, rather than just passing through Jupiter system on random trajectory determined by where it entered solar system and how gravitational dynamics subsequently evolved its path. What gets me particularly about the timing is what happened in January 2026, just 2 months before the predicted Euphemia encounter. Euphemia reached its apogee, the most distant point in its orbit from Jupiter. The Moon's orbit is elliptical rather than circular, which is common for captured objects that haven't had time or haven't experienced sufficient perturbations to circularize. And when orbit is elliptical, there's point of closest approach to the planet called perigove, and point of farthest distance called apogee. Those points are where orbital dynamics are most sensitive, where small velocity changes can have large effects on subsequent orbital evolution. And Eupheme's apogee in January 2026 positioned the Moon optimally for rendezvous with incoming object, positioned it such that 3I Atlas's trajectory and Eupheme's position would align on March 17th. It's almost as if Eupheme stepped out of crowd to meet visitor halfway, as if the orbital configuration that existed billions of years ago, when Eupheme was supposedly captured, has maintained itself or been maintained specifically to enable this rendezvous. This kind of orbital synchronization is statistically haunting, is exactly what you'd engineer if you were planning rendezvous, but is extraordinarily unlikely to occur through coincidence. It's like trying to hit moving fly with needle from mile away in darkness, without knowing where the fly will be and having single attempt to make the throw. The probability that you succeed is so low that observing success forces reconsideration of assumptions, forces asking whether maybe you did know where the fly would be, whether maybe the throw wasn't random but was aimed, whether maybe the success indicates planning rather than luck. And that's where we are with 3I Atlas and Eupheme, observing alignment that natural processes shouldn't produce, but that navigation would create as expected outcome. I don't know if this interpretation is right. Don't know if we're actually witnessing rendezvous between interstellar visitor and dormant station that's been waiting in Jupiter orbit. Can't prove that technological explanation is correct just because natural explanation seems statistically improbable. But it's hard not to feel like we're watching handoff, like long drift through darkness is ending and docking is about to begin. Like whatever 3I Atlas has been carrying across interstellar distances is about to be delivered to destination that's been prepared to receive it. If 3I Atlas enters stable orbit, if it becomes gravitationally bound to Jupiter and begins circling the planet as 96th moon, rather than continuing on hyperbolic trajectory that carries it back into interstellar space, the captured asteroid theory falls apart completely, because rocks don't just decide to join retrograde group. Don't execute the precise velocity changes and trajectory adjustments needed to match orbital parameters with existing irregular satellites. They're placed there, either through deliberate navigation or through mechanisms that are functionally equivalent to navigation, even if not involving conscious intent. We are currently tracking the object's light curve. That's the technical term for how brightness varies with time. For rotating object with irregular shape, light curve reveals rotation period and gives clues about shape and orientation. For object with variable surface properties, light curve can show which regions are more or less reflective. For object that's outgassing, light curve can reveal activity patterns and how they correlate with solar heating. All useful information that skilled analysis can extract from simple brightness measurements over time, and what that light curve is showing for 3I Atlas is metallic sheen that's almost impossible for natural object to maintain. It's too clean, too reflective, too consistent across rotation phases and across viewing geometries. Natural surfaces are rough, are covered with dust and regolith from eons of micrometeorite bombardment, show variations in albedo where different compositional units or different surface ages create patchwork of bright and dark regions. But 3I Atlas shows reflectivity that's more uniform than natural surfaces typically display, shows characteristics suggesting smooth metal rather than rough rock. Shows exactly what you'd expect from manufactured hull that's been protected from surface degradation, or that's designed to minimize such degradation. It's as if object just woke up after very long sleep. As if protective coating that shielded it during transit has been removed or has sublimated away, revealing underlying structure that was preserved in pristine condition. As if systems that were dormant during cruise phase are activating as destination approaches and as mission transitions from transit to arrival operations. That's anthropomorphizing. That's reading intention into observations that might have prosaic natural explanations. But the pattern fits. The timing fits. Everything we're observing is consistent with spacecraft completing interstellar journey and preparing for orbital insertion and rendezvous with destination. The silence from scientific community on this orbital synchronization is what troubles me most. The lack of public discussion about statistical improbability, the absence of papers analyzing whether natural capture can explain the timing, or whether alternative explanations need serious consideration. We're told it's coincidence. told that unusual alignments happen occasionally, and that this is just one of those times when improbable events occur because given enough time and enough opportunities, even very unlikely things eventually happen. But in space, coincidences are just math we haven't admitted to yet. Are situations where probability calculations show that what we're calling random is actually so improbable that calling it random becomes less plausible than admitting some organizing principle is operating. If you see two objects in middle of void moving toward each other with precision that 3i Atlas and Euphemia are displaying, if you calculate the probability that such encounter would occur through unguided gravitational dynamics, if you find that probability is 1 in billions or worse, you have to stop calling it physics and start calling it navigation. You have to acknowledge that what you're observing looks designed, looks planned, looks executed according to purpose rather than according to random chance producing coincidental outcome. We are watching 1947-style event play out in slow motion. That's deliberate reference. That's invoking specific historical moment that's relevant for understanding how institutions respond to evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about humanity's cosmic context. And most people are still arguing about whether images smudge on lens, whether observations are artifacts or errors, or misinterpretations rather than representing something genuinely anomalous. But the lens is clear. The instruments are working properly. The math is rigorous. The destination is euphemy. The arrival date is March 17th. The precision is impossible for natural processes, and the silence about what this means is becoming deafening. I cannot shake the feeling that we are being told to look away. That institutional response is designed to minimize attention rather than to maximize investigation. That the absence of high-resolution imaging campaigns and the classification of data and the carefully neutral language in official communications are all symptoms of strategy that prioritizes controlling narrative over pursuing truth. Because if the data were being handled as normal scientific discovery, we'd see different response, would see mobilization of observational resources, would see papers being published rapidly as researchers compete to characterize this unique visitor, would see open sharing of findings and vigorous debate about interpretations, rather than careful silence, punctuated by occasional bland statements that everything is being studied and that conclusions would be premature at this stage. There's metaphor that has been circulating in certain corners of scientific community lately, the alligator paradox. It's thought experiment about perception and about how labels we apply shape what we allow ourselves to see and what conclusions we permit ourselves to draw. Imagine two people looking at river. They see long, dark shape floating near the surface. One person says, "Look at that log," sees piece of wood that's been carried downstream by current, sees natural object that's common in rivers and that doesn't require any special explanation or any particular response. Just part of the environment. Just background feature that you note and then ignore. The other person says, "That's not a log. Look at the eyes. Look at the way it's moving against the current. Look at how it's maintaining position rather than drifting. That's an alligator." And once you see it as alligator, once you recognize that this isn't passive wood but is instead active predator, everything changes. You can't go back in the water. You have to admit that there's dangerous creature in your environment. You have to modify your behavior accordingly. You have to accept that the river isn't safe the way you thought it was. That assumption about safety was wrong, and that maintaining that assumption could be fatal. The person who sees log is comfortable. Log is safe. Log doesn't change your world. Log doesn't require you to question assumptions or to modify behaviors or to accept that environment is different from what you believed. You can continue as before, can swim and wade and treat river as benign resource rather than as potential threat. The psychological comfort of seeing log is enormous. Is why people resist reinterpretation even when evidence accumulates that the log has eyes and teeth and is tracking your movements with predatory intelligence. But if it's alligator, if you admit that the shape in water is not what you initially labeled it, then everything changes. Your relationship with the river transforms, your understanding of what's possible in this environment expands, your risk assessment updates, your future decisions account for predator presence. You can't unknow what you've seen, can't return to previous innocent assumption that nothing dangerous was there. The knowledge changes you permanently. 3i Atlas is our alligator. We see the non-gravitational acceleration that natural objects shouldn't display. We see the industrial chemical signature, the nickel without proportional iron, that suggests manufacturing rather than natural accretion. We see the pinpoint targeting of a retrograde moon with timing that statistics say shouldn't occur through chance. We see all the features that distinguish design system from natural object. We see the eyes. We see the movement against current. We see evidence that what we're calling log is actually predator. But the log people, the mainstream institutions, the official scientific establishment, the voices that shape public understanding, are desperate to maintain log interpretation. They have to. They're institutionally and psychologically committed to log framework, because if they admit it's alligator, they have to admit we're not alone, have to admit that cosmos isn't empty, have to admit that visitors can arrive without permission and that we might not be able to control or even influence what they do once they're here, have to admit that fundamental assumption about human cosmic significance and isolation was wrong. And that admission carries implications that ripple through every aspect of how society is organized and how we think about ourselves and our future and our place in the universe. This is where the CIA and the national security state enter the picture, where what starts as astronomical curiosity about unusual interstellar visitor becomes matter of classified protocols and restricted information access, and careful management of what gets released to public versus what gets sequestered behind security classifications. It has recently been revealed, not through official announcements but through leaks, and through careful analysis of what information is conspicuously absent from public domain, that 3i Atlas data is being handled under protocols dating back to 1947, specifically to directives established in that year for dealing with certain categories of aerial phenomena and potential non-human technology. For those who know their history, for those who've studied how government institutions responded to events that challenged assumptions about human uniqueness and technological supremacy, 1947 is a significant year. That's when Roswell incident occurred. When something crashed in New Mexico desert, and when official explanations shifted rapidly from recovered flying disc in initial press release to weather balloon in subsequent clarifications to ongoing classification and denial that persists 8 decades later. Whether you believe Roswell involved extraterrestrial technology, or whether you think it was genuinely just classified military hardware being tested and being covered up through misdirection, what's undeniable is that 1947 established template for how institutions handle evidence that might indicate non-human intelligence. Those protocols involve compartmentalization of information, involve restricting access to need-to-know basis, where even researchers working on related questions don't get to see full picture, involve classification levels that prevent public disclosure, involve careful management of narrative through official spokespeople who provide minimal information using deliberately vague language that can be interpreted multiple ways depending on what audience wants to believe, involve creating environment where serious investigation is discouraged through professional consequences for researchers who pursue questions too aggressively or who reach conclusions that challenge preferred narrative. Why would Comet trigger 70-year-old secrecy protocol? Why would protocols designed for managing potential evidence of non-human technology be applied to object that official statements characterize as unusual but natural interstellar visitor? The answer is obvious if you're willing to consider it. The protocols are being used because whoever controls those protocols has concluded that 3i Atlas might not be natural, that it might represent exactly the kind of non-human technology that the 1947 directives were established to manage, that treating it as routine astronomical discovery would be inappropriate given the possibility that we're actually observing first confirmed artificial object from beyond our solar system. But that conclusion can't be stated publicly, can't be acknowledged in official channels because doing so would trigger a cascade of consequences that institutions aren't prepared to handle, would create public demand for transparency that conflicts with classification requirements, would undermine carefully maintained position that we're alone and that any suggestions otherwise are fringe speculation unsupported by credible evidence, would force confronting questions about whether other visitors have arrived previously and whether the silence about cosmic neighbours has been based on genuine ignorance or on deliberate concealment of information that select groups possessed but chose not to share. The silence from official channels is becoming deafening, is exactly what you would expect if something significant is being managed rather than being openly investigated. Why are high-resolution images being classified? We have telescopes capable of resolving surface details on objects much smaller and much more distant than 3i Atlas. We have imaging technology that could show whether the surface is natural rough rock or smooth manufactured hull. We have spectroscopic instruments that could definitively characterize composition and determine whether the nickel signature is actually anomalous in ways that indicate industrial processing. All of this data could be collected. Much of it probably has been collected. But it's not being released. Why is 1947's Secrecy Act being used to redact orbital coordinates? The trajectory of 3I Atlas is being tracked by amateur astronomers and by observatories worldwide. The orbital elements are calculable by anyone with access to positional measurements across time. There's no security benefit to classifying coordinates that multiple independent observers can determine. Unless the classification isn't about preventing adversaries from knowing where object is, but is instead about controlling narrative, about ensuring that official sources remain gatekeepers for information, rather than allowing distributed observation network to build comprehensive understanding independent of institutional oversight. You don't hide information about Snowball. You don't invoke national security protocols for protecting data about chunk of ice and rock following predictable trajectory through solar system. You hide information about probe, about technology, about evidence that challenges foundational assumptions about humanity's place in cosmos, about discoveries that carry implications for everything from military preparedness to religious worldviews to economic systems predicated on Earth-centric resource availability and Earth-centric technological development. 3I Atlas is moving against current of solar system. That's not metaphor, that's description of its trajectory. Most objects in solar system orbit Sun in same direction, in same plane, following paths established during solar system formation, when rotating disk of gas and dust collapsed into planets and asteroids and comets. That prograde motion, motion in direction of original disk rotation, is signature of objects that formed here, that belong to this system. Interstellar visitors by definition arrive from outside, can arrive from any direction, can have trajectories that are retrograde relative to solar system's predominant motion, and 3I Atlas is doing exactly that, is crossing through system on path that looks wrong relative to everything else. That marks it as outsider. That makes it obvious this object didn't form here and doesn't belong to natural population of solar system bodies, and it's heading straight for boat. For the Ananka group, for collection of objects that are also moving wrong, that are also retrograde, that are also outsiders even though they've been here longer and are now considered part of Jupiter system through gravitational capture. The convergence isn't subtle, the pattern isn't hidden. The trajectory calculations that any competent orbital dynamicist can perform show unambiguously where 3I Atlas is going and when it will arrive. But official statements remain carefully neutral, remain focused on characterizing objects' composition and rotation state and outgassing patterns without addressing the elephant in the room, which is that the destination suggests purpose and that purpose suggests intelligence. Some astronomers argue it's just fragmenting body, that internal stresses or thermal gradients or tidal forces from Sun during perihelion passage are causing object to break apart, that fragments are separating with different velocities creating illusion of trajectory control, when what's actually happening is that center of mass is shifting as pieces separate, that this fragmentation could explain both the apparent velocity changes and the structural modifications that observations suggest are occurring. That invoking propulsion or navigation is premature when natural dynamical effects haven't been ruled out, but fragments don't perform orbital corrections, don't adjust trajectories in coordinated fashion to maintain rendezvous schedule, don't show the kind of coherent behavior where separate pieces would need to be moving in precisely calibrated ways to produce observed trajectory evolution. Random fragmentation creates chaos, creates unpredictable separations, creates debris clouds that disperse according to whatever velocities fragmentation imparted, without organizing into patterns that maintain specific geometric configurations or that converge towards specific destinations. What we observe with 3I Atlas isn't chaos, is organization. Is trajectory that's evolving towards specific target with timing that matches predictions based on assuming controlled flight rather than ballistic drift. Is exactly what you'd see if propulsion were operating intermittently to maintain course. Is signature of navigation rather than signature of fragmentation. The attempt to explain away the rendezvous through fragmentation requires special pleading, requires that fragmentation occur in very specific ways that coincidentally produce velocity changes that happen to point object toward eupheme with arrival timing that happens to align with orbital synchronization that makes rendezvous possible. Stacks improbabilities on improbabilities until explanation becomes more contrived than what it's trying to explain. We are watching birth of 96th moon. That's what happens if 3I Atlas enters stable orbit around Jupiter. That's the outcome that trajectory predicts if object successfully executes capture maneuver. Moon that wasn't there yesterday. Moon that arrived from another stellar system. Moon that chose to stay rather than being randomly captured through processes that we can barely make work in computer simulations, even when we tune parameters optimally. And if that happens, if March 18th dawns and orbital tracking shows 3I Atlas circling Jupiter, rather than departing on hyperbolic trajectory, we can't maintain log interpretation anymore. Can't pretend this is natural phenomenon. Can't avoid confronting that we've witnessed arrival rather than just flyby. What gets me about the psychological impact of the secrecy is how it creates perpetual uncertainty. How it keeps population in state where we can't know for certain what's happening, even though evidence accumulates pointing towards specific conclusion. As long as it's classified, as long as high-resolution data isn't released, as long as official statements remain ambiguous, it remains just weird comet in public consciousness. Remains something we can file away as interesting anomaly, without having to change worldview. Without having to accept that silence of cosmos has been broken and that visitors are here. But 3I Atlas is forcing our eyes open whether we want to look or not, is creating situation where pretending becomes harder as March 17th approaches and as predictions become testable, is building toward a moment when orbital insertion either happens or doesn't happen, and when that outcome will be observable by anyone with telescope capable of tracking Jupiter's moons, is removing the ambiguity that institutions rely on for maintaining both log interpretation and alligator interpretation simultaneously, while never committing to either. If Avilob is right, if his analysis of what's required for interstellar object to be captured is correct, and if new moon is detected after March 17th in orbit that matches where 3I Atlas should be, if capture occurred, it's irrefutable evidence of technology. Nature does not have brakes, does not have propulsion systems capable of shedding velocity on command, does not have navigation capability that targets specific moons and that executes rendezvous with timing precision that statistics say is impossible through chance. But technology does have all those capabilities. Technology is exactly what would produce signatures we're observing if we stop filtering observations through assumption that everything must be natural. We are living through days that will be written about in textbooks 1,000 years from now. Whether those textbooks describe March 2026 as moment when humanity confirmed we're not alone, or whether they describe it as interesting astronomical event that turned out to have natural explanation, we eventually identified depends on what actually happens, and on whether institutions choose transparency over continued secrecy. But the significance is undeniable. The stakes are clear. We're approaching threshold that transforms everything, or that confirms our isolation depending on which interpretation proves correct. The log is about to show its teeth. That's inevitable as March approaches and as predictions become testable, and as observations either confirm or refute the rendezvous scenario. The void will finally have voice. We'll speak through 3I Atlas's trajectory, and through whether that trajectory ends in capture or in departure. We'll answer question about whether we're alone not through radio signals or through optical beacons, but through demonstration of capabilities that natural objects don't possess. We'll force confrontation with reality that institutions have been managing through classification, and through ambiguity and through deflection. I don't know if we're ready for what happens when that voice finally speaks. Don't know how society responds when official statements can no longer maintain careful neutrality, because observations force definitive conclusions. Don't know whether disclosure would be managed or whether it would be chaotic as different factions push competing narratives, and as public processes information that challenges fundamental assumptions about cosmic context. Don't know whether the response would be celebration or fear or denial or some mixture, depending on cultural and ideological frameworks that different populations bring to interpreting what arrival means. But we can't keep pretending river is empty, can't maintain comfortable fiction that we're alone when evidence accumulates that we're not. Can't keep seeing log when alligator's eyes are visible, and when movement against current demonstrates this isn't passive drift but active navigation. The alligator is here, is approaching Jupiter, is preparing for rendezvous with Eupheme, is demonstrating capabilities that force reconsideration of assumptions we've held for centuries about human uniqueness and cosmic isolation. It's hungry for destination. That's what the trajectory shows. That's what the precision demonstrates. That's what the timing reveals. And it's already parking in driveway. Is already executing final approach to location, where it will either be captured into stable orbit or will continue past on hyperbolic trajectory that carries it back into interstellar space. The choice, if it is choice, if navigation is occurring, will be made in next few weeks. Will be observable, will be documented, will become part of historical record that future generations examine when they study how humanity responded to first confirmed contact with technology from beyond our solar system. There is certain sadness in realizing how much we've been kept in darkness, how much information exists behind classifications that public doesn't have access to. How many observations have been made by military sensors and by classified space surveillance systems that track everything in Earth orbit and beyond, but that don't share their findings outside secure channels? How much evidence might already exist about 3i Atlas's nature and origin and purpose that select groups have access to while rest of us are left to infer from limited public data and from carefully managed official statements? We spent centuries thinking we were only ones observing the stars, that we were active agents studying passive universe. That discovery would come through our initiative and our technology, revealing cosmic secrets that were hidden only because we hadn't yet developed instruments sensitive enough to detect them, never realizing that stars might be observing us back, that cosmos might not be passive at all, but might instead be populated with observers who have capabilities we don't possess, and who have been monitoring human development waiting for us to reach technological threshold, where contact becomes appropriate or inevitable. The arrival of 3i Atlas isn't just threat or wonder, isn't just astronomical event to be characterized and catalogued and filed away with other discoveries, is mirror. Shows us how little we actually know about our own backyard, about what exists in solar system, about what visitors have arrived previously, or what structures might already be present waiting to be noticed by observers who know what to look for, about how much of our cosmic ignorance is genuine limitation versus how much is manufactured through selective information sharing and through institutional decisions about what gets disclosed versus what gets classified. As 3i Atlas settles in among irregular moons of Jupiter, if it settles, if capture occurs, if predictions prove correct, it's a reminder that solar system isn't museum, isn't dead collection of rocks and ice left over from formation processes that concluded billions of years ago, is living, breathing harbour. Is waypoint or destination or resource depot or observation post depending on perspectives of those who visit. Is part of cosmic ecology, where objects transit between stellar systems and where presence of intelligence and technology might be common rather than rare if we just looked properly instead of filtering observations through assumptions that require everything to be natural. And we're just latest guests to arrive at party, are newcomers to stellar neighbourhood that might be more crowded than we assumed, are encountering environment that contains evidence of previous visitors or current residents if we're willing to see it, are being forced to reconsider whether human history unfolded in isolation or whether it occurred under observation by others who chose not to intervene or who intervened so subtly that we interpreted their actions as natural phenomena rather than recognizing artificial origins. I don't know what you'll be doing on March 16th, 2026. Don't know what your plans are for that evening or the following morning. Don't know whether you'll be working or sleeping or going about ordinary activities that fill normal days. But I know where I'll be. I'll be watching the telemetry, monitoring the tracking data, following the updates from observatories that are documenting 3i Atlas's approach to the Hill sphere boundary, waiting for the moment when the map of our solar system is redrawn forever. When Jupiter's moon count increases from 95 to 96, not through discovery of previously undetected natural satellite, but through capture of visitor that arrived from interstellar space following trajectory that looks nothing like random gravitational dynamics. It's strange feeling, isn't it? To know that universe is so much bigger and more crowded than we were ever told. To recognize that official narratives about cosmic isolation might be incorrect not through innocent error, but through deliberate management of information that institutions decided public wasn't ready to process. To understand that what we've been calling empty void might actually be populated with travelers and with infrastructure and with presences that we haven't noticed because we weren't looking properly or because we were discouraged from looking or because those who did look and who did notice were prevented from sharing what they found. The magnitude of paradigm shift that 3i Atlas represents is difficult to fully grasp. We're talking about end of Copernican isolation, about recognition that we're not just spatially displaced from cosmic centre. We knew that already, knew we orbit ordinary star in ordinary galaxy with nothing special about our location, but are temporally late to technological development, are newcomers to neighbourhood where others have been operating for unknown duration, are encountering evidence of capabilities that exceed ours potentially by margins we can barely comprehend. If 3i Atlas is artificial, if the trajectory and the timing and the chemical signature and all the accumulated anomalies actually do indicate technology, rather than being explicable through exotic natural processes, then whoever built it has mastered interstellar travel, has solved engineering challenges that we're still struggling with in preliminary design studies and in theoretical papers, has developed propulsion systems that can accelerate payloads to velocities sufficient for crossing light years in reasonable time and then decelerate them for orbital insertion at destination, has built structures that survive interstellar environment for durations that might be centuries or millennia, has achieved exactly what human space programs aspire to but haven't yet accomplished. And if they can do that, if interstellar travel is within their demonstrated capabilities, rather than just being theoretical possibility, what else can they do? What other technologies have they developed? What resources do they have access to that we don't? What purposes drive their actions? What values shape their decisions about where to go and what to do when they arrive? What intentions guide their interactions with other species and other civilizations they encounter? All unknowns. All questions that we can't answer through remote observation. All requiring either direct communication or careful inference from behaviours we can observe across extended time. The strategic implications are what keep military and intelligence communities focused on this regardless of whether scientific establishment remains ambivalent. Because if visitors can arrive without permission, if they can navigate to specific destinations within our solar system, if they demonstrate capabilities we can't match, then fundamental assumptions about security and about territorial sovereignty and about ability to control access to Earth's neighbourhood become questionable. We're accustomed to thinking about planetary defence in terms of asteroids and comets that might impact Earth through natural orbital evolution, have developed tracking systems and deflection concepts for dealing with those threats. But what if the threat, if it is threat, if visitors have hostile rather than benign or neutral intentions, comes from directed objects rather than from random ones? What if navigation capability means that simply detecting trajectory isn't sufficient because that trajectory can change? What if propulsion capability means that deflection strategies designed for altering natural orbits don't work against systems that can compensate for our interference? What if we're facing visitors who can do things we can't, and who might have purposes that conflict with human interests? Those scenarios require different response frameworks than what planetary defense programs have developed for natural impact hazards. And the silence about these strategic implications, the absence of public discussion about what arrival of technological visitors would mean for security architecture and for international cooperation, and for how humanity manages its relationship with potentially more advanced neighbours, is telling. Suggests that conversations are happening but in classified channels, that planning is occurring but not transparently, that institutions are preparing for contingencies that public isn't being informed about because informing public would require acknowledging possibilities that official narrative still denies. The scientific opportunities that 3i Atlas represents are extraordinary if we can overcome institutional barriers to proper investigation. Every measurement we make, every observation we collect, every analysis we perform teaches us about what's possible. If object is natural, we learn about interstellar chemistry and about how objects form in other stellar systems, and about how they survive journeys through galaxy, and about how solar-wind interaction works with visitors that have compositions different from solar system bodies. If object is artificial, we learn about engineering approaches and about materials science, and about propulsion technologies, and about mission architectures that might inform our own attempts to develop interstellar capabilities. Either way, the scientific return is immense, is exactly why resources should be mobilized for comprehensive characterization rather than being restricted through classification or through institutional resistance to investigating questions that seem too exotic. We have unique opportunity to study interstellar visitor at close range with modern instruments that didn't exist when Oumuamua passed through in 2017, or even when 2I Borisov was observed in 2019. We have better spectroscopic capabilities, better imaging resolution, better theoretical frameworks for interpreting observations, better computational tools for modelling dynamics, and for testing hypotheses against data. But taking advantage of those capabilities requires treating 3I Atlas as priority target, deserving sustained observation campaign rather than as curiosity that gets occasional attention when telescope time is available and when researchers have finished with their primary programs, requires international coordination so that observations aren't duplicated unnecessarily and so that coverage gaps are minimized. Requires data sharing so that analyses can build on each other rather than being siloed in separate institutions with different access levels and different constraints on publication. Requires all the things that should happen automatically for genuinely significant discovery, but that don't happen when discovery challenges assumptions and threatens established narratives. The March 17th rendezvous with Eufeme provides a natural experiment that tests whether 3I Atlas is under control. If object passes through predicted encounter geometry, maintaining trajectory toward continued solar system exit, that's consistent with ballistic motion following gravitational dynamics without propulsion. If object alters trajectory during encounter, if velocity or direction changes in ways that aren't explicable through gravitational interaction with tiny moon that has negligible mass, that's evidence of active maneuvering. If object enters orbit around Jupiter following the encounter, if it becomes gravitationally bound and begins circling the planet as permanent addition to Jovian satellite system, that's definitive proof that velocity was reduced through mechanism beyond what natural processes provide. That proof is observable, is testable, is not subject to interpretation or ambiguity the way that many other aspects of 3I Atlas investigation are. Either the object is captured or it isn't. Either it orbits Jupiter after March 17th or it doesn't. Either the orbital elements indicate bound trajectory or they indicate hyperbolic departure. All questions that tracking data answers unambiguously within days or weeks after the encounter, as observations accumulate sufficient precision to determine orbital parameters confidently. No room for continued debate about whether something unusual happened. The outcome will be clear, and that clarity is exactly why March 2026 matters so much. Is why this date represents threshold, rather than being just another observation epoch in ongoing characterization campaign. Is why institutions might be nervous about what happens when predictions either prove correct or fail. Because if predictions prove correct, if 3I Atlas does enter orbit and does become 96th moon, the pressure for explanation becomes intense. Can't dismiss it as measurement error or as misinterpretation when independent observers worldwide confirm the same result. Can't maintain that it's just unusual natural object when natural objects don't do what observations would show this one did. Have to provide account of how capture occurred, and that account either invokes physics we don't understand or acknowledges technology we didn't build. The public response to that acknowledgement is unpredictable, depends on how disclosure is managed, depends on what information is released and in what sequence and with what framing, depends on whether official statements treat it as threat requiring defensive posture, or as opportunity requiring open engagement, or as mystery requiring continued study before conclusions can be drawn. Depends on cultural context that different populations bring to processing news that we're not alone. Depends on religious frameworks and philosophical traditions and science fiction narratives that have shaped expectations about what contact would mean and how it would occur. Some people will celebrate, will see it as vindication of belief that life is common and that galaxy is populated and that human isolation was always illusion, waiting to be dispelled by evidence, will welcome visitors, will want communication, will push for attempts to establish dialogue or to understand purposes that brought travellers to our solar system. We'll see it as beginning of new era, where humanity joins larger cosmic community, and where access to knowledge and technology from more advanced civilizations accelerates our own development. Others will fear, will see visitors as potential threat. We'll worry about intentions and capabilities, and about whether our interests align with theirs or conflict. We'll demand military response or defensive preparations. We'll want to understand not just what visitors can do, but what they want, and whether their wants are compatible with human survival and flourishing. We'll invoke historical parallels where contact between civilizations with different technological levels resulted in domination or exploitation or destruction of less advanced group, will argue for caution and for prioritizing security over curiosity. Still others will deny, will reject evidence regardless of how compelling it becomes, will find alternative explanations no matter how contrived, will maintain that everything is natural and that technological interpretation is hoax or misunderstanding or conspiracy theory manufactured by those who want to believe in aliens despite lack of proof, will filter observations through confirmation bias that preserves existing worldview against challenges that evidence presents, will represent fraction of population that never accepts paradigm shifts even when scientific consensus eventually converges on revolutionary conclusions. All of these responses are predictable. All will manifest across different segments of population with different psychological profiles and different cultural backgrounds and different prior beliefs about cosmic life. Managing that diversity of responses, creating conditions where productive engagement can occur despite disagreement about interpretation and implications, is challenge that institutions haven't prepared for adequately. Because preparation would require acknowledging possibility that arrival might occur, would require planning for scenarios that official narrative still denies are plausible, would require treating SETI not as purely scientific endeavour, but as preparation for events that carry profound social and political consequences. The comparison to 1947 Roswell incident is instructive, not because parallels are exact, but because they reveal patterns in how institutions respond when confronted with evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions. Whether Roswell actually involved extraterrestrial technology, or whether it was classified military program being tested, institutional response was same: immediate classification, rapid narrative shift from initial disclosure to subsequent denial, creation of protocols for managing information flow, marginalization of witnesses who insisted events were extraordinary rather than prosaic. Those patterns didn't emerge because government was inherently secretive, or because bureaucrats enjoyed withholding information. Emerged because disclosure carried risks to security, to social stability, to institutional credibility, that classified management seemed to mitigate even if it created other problems through lack of transparency. And those same patterns are visible in how 3i Atlas is being handled. Initial observations get released because they're collected by distributed observer networks that institutions don't control. But high-resolution follow-up data gets classified. Trajectory predictions that should be straightforward to publish get restricted. Official statements remain carefully neutral, avoiding definitive characterizations while data accumulates that makes certain characterizations increasingly difficult to avoid. Researchers who want to investigate artificial possibilities find funding difficult to obtain and find publication venues resistant to papers that make those arguments explicitly. All symptoms of institutional management designed to control narrative, until control becomes impossible because observations force conclusions that ambiguity can't obscure. The difference between 1947 and 2026 is that 3i Atlas arrival is being observed by global scientific community using instruments that produce data that can be independently verified, rather than being isolated incident where witnesses can be debriefed, and evidence can be secured, and narrative can be managed through controlling access. Can't put toothpaste back in tube when thousands of astronomers are tracking object, and when amateur observers are photographing it, and when orbital predictions are being made by independent analysts who aren't subject to institutional control. The distributed observation network creates transparency that 1947 technologies and social structures didn't enable. But that transparency creates its own challenges, creates environment where competing narratives develop simultaneously as different groups interpret same observations through different frameworks, creates information ecosystem where truth becomes difficult to distinguish from speculation because both circulate through same channels with equal accessibility, creates demand for authoritative arbitration about what's actually happening that institutions are reluctant to provide because providing it requires committing to interpretations that might prove wrong, or that might reveal information that's classified, or that might trigger responses institutions aren't prepared to manage. So we end up in a strange liminal state where evidence accumulates but consensus doesn't form, where observations are documented but implications aren't acknowledged, where everyone can see that something unusual is happening but official sources won't confirm what that something might be, where March 17th approaches as date when predictions become testable, but where preparation for what happens afterward remains inadequate, because preparing would require admitting possibilities that narrative still denies. Its uncomfortable position creates tension between what data shows and what institutions will say, creates gap that speculation fills because nature abhors vacuum and information vacuum is no exception. Sometimes I think we underestimate how quiet universe can be, how accustomed we've become to that silence, how much our psychology and our philosophy and our social structures depend on assumption that we're alone. That silence has allowed us to imagine we're special, has permitted belief that human intelligence is unique cosmic achievement, has enabled treating Earth as centre of meaning even while acknowledging it's not centre of physical universe, has given a sense of importance and purpose that might be harder to maintain if we accepted we're just one among many, just latest species to develop technology, just recent arrival in neighbourhood that's been occupied for unknown duration by others who got here first. That silence has been comfortable, has made cosmos manageable, has allowed us to explore at our own pace without pressure of comparison to what others have achieved, has let us believe that our timeline, our progression from first technology to spaceflight to potential interstellar capability, is natural developmental arc rather than being slow or delayed or inefficient compared to how others approach similar challenges, has protected us from confronting how much we don't know and how far we have to go before we'd be peers to civilizations that can already do what we're still dreaming about. But that silence is about to be broken. Not through radio signal carrying greeting from distant star. Not through optical beacon flashing message across interstellar distances. Not through any of the modalities that SETI programs have been monitoring for decades, but through demonstration, through arrival. Through physical presence that can't be explained away as natural phenomenon or dismissed as misinterpretation of ambiguous signals. The void is talking now. Is speaking through 3I Atlas's trajectory and through its precision and through its apparent intent. And what it's saying is that we're not alone, that visitors arrive, that cosmos is populated, that the silence was only ever our ignorance mistaken for cosmic emptiness. 3I Atlas is the message. Is communication through action rather than through words. Is demonstration of capabilities that answers questions about whether interstellar travel is possible, not through theory or through speculation, but through existence proof that something crossed the light years and arrived here. Is evidence that forces reconsideration of assumptions regardless of how comfortable those assumptions were or how much we'd prefer to maintain them. Is breaking silence not violently or dramatically but inexorably. Moving forward on trajectory that brings it closer daily to rendezvous, that will either confirm or refute technological interpretation, depending on what actually happens when March 17th arrives. If you want to stay with us as we track this arrival into Heart of Jovian system, as we monitor approach to Hill sphere boundary and encounter with Eupheme and potential capture into stable orbit, you need to subscribe. Need to be part of community that's documenting this in real time rather than reading about it afterward in retrospective accounts that might be sanitized or filtered through institutional narratives that don't reflect what actually occurred. Hit subscribe button, leave like on this video so algorithm knows people care, and continues recommending this content to others who should be informed about what's happening. This is too important to miss because you didn't take 2 seconds to click buttons that ensure you stay connected to ongoing investigation. And if you have theory about what's waiting at Eupheme, if you have thoughts about what rendezvous might reveal, or what purpose might drive visitor that crossed interstellar distances to arrive at tiny retrograde moon orbiting Jupiter, leave comment. We read all of them. Take them seriously. Engage with ideas that people contribute because in this journey we're all we have. Official channels aren't providing information we need. Mainstream institutions aren't asking questions that need asking. So it falls to community of engaged observers to build understanding through shared analysis and through collective interpretation of data that's available even when context is withheld and when explanations are carefully managed to avoid acknowledging obvious conclusions. If you find this type of content valuable, if you want to support deeper investigation into mysteries that universe presents and that institutions would prefer we ignore, consider becoming member. Contributing directly to work that goes into researching and analysing and presenting information that challenges comfortable narratives. Small support enables much larger search for truth, enables continued coverage through March 17th and beyond regardless of whether that coverage attracts mainstream attention or remains niche interest that only those who care deeply about these questions pursue. Every contribution matters. Every member makes difference between being able to continue this investigation seriously versus treating it as hobby that gets attention only when time permits. Until alligator finally shows its teeth, until evidence becomes undeniable, and until institutional silence gives way to acknowledgement that something extraordinary is happening, we keep watching, keep documenting, keep analysing, keep asking questions that need answers even when those answers are uncomfortable. Stay curious, maintain skepticism, but not cynicism. Demand evidence, but remain open to possibilities that evidence supports even when those possibilities challenge worldviews. Balance critical thinking with willingness to update beliefs when data requires it. Avoid both gullibility that accepts claims without verification and rigid skepticism that rejects evidence because implications are disturbing. Because stars are definitely watching us. That's not metaphor. That's description of what sensors and instruments might exist throughout galaxy, built by civilizations that developed technology before us, and that maintain observation networks monitoring stellar systems where life might be developing or where intelligence might be emerging. We observe cosmos, send telescopes into space, point instruments at distant stars and galaxies, collect photons that travelled millions or billions of years to reach us, build understanding through passive observation without interacting with objects we study. Why would we assume others don't do same? Why would we imagine that we're unique in developing observational astronomy, or in building instruments that detect electromagnetic radiation, or in cataloguing stellar systems and tracking their evolution? If intelligence is common, if technology emerges repeatedly throughout galaxy's history, then observation networks might be common too, might be part of cosmic infrastructure that advanced civilizations maintain for scientific or security or diplomatic purposes. And Earth, planet with biosphere that's been visible spectroscopically for billions of years, and with technology that's been detectable electromagnetically for centuries, might be exactly the kind of system that gets monitored. 3i Atlas might be part of that monitoring, might be probes sent to observe solar system more closely than remote sensing allows, might be updating databases that haven't been refreshed since last visitor passed through however long ago that was, might be collecting information about human technological development and about social organization, and about whether we're approaching thresholds that make us relevant to broader galactic community, might be preparing for contact or for continued observation, or for whatever responses galactic protocols specify for systems at our development level. Or might be serving completely different purposes that our experience doesn't prepare us to imagine. Might be refueling stop for journeys that continue beyond solar system to other destinations. Might be maintenance check where systems that have been operating for extended duration get serviced or repaired or upgraded. Might be rendezvous between vessels that coordinate activities across multiple stellar systems. Might be archaeological investigation examining how planetary systems evolve and how life develops and how intelligence emerges and how civilizations rise and fall. All speculation. All attempts to understand purposes through analogies to human activities when actual purposes might be orthogonal to anything we'd conceive. The humility that comes from accepting we might be observing something we don't understand, something operating according to purposes and priorities that aren't immediately comprehensible through our limited experience, is appropriate response to 3i Atlas, is recognition that jumping to conclusions about what it is or what it wants or what it represents might be premature when we're dealing with potential first contact scenario where everything we think we know might be wrong. Better to observe carefully, to document thoroughly, to analyze rigorously, to test hypotheses against data, to remain open to multiple interpretations until evidence forces convergence towards specific conclusions. But remaining open doesn't mean accepting that everything is uncertain or that all interpretations are equally valid. It means acknowledging that some explanations fit observations better than others. That natural comet hypothesis struggles to account for trajectory precision and chemical signatures and apparent navigation towards specific target. That artificial probe hypothesis explains observations more parsimoniously, even though it requires accepting that interstellar visitors exist and that they've arrived in our solar system. That evidence currently available favours technological interpretation, while acknowledging that evidence could change and that natural explanations that we haven't considered might exist. The test comes on March 17th and in days immediately following. Comes when predictions about rendezvous become checkable through observations that anyone with appropriate equipment can make. comes when orbital insertion either occurs or doesn't occur, and when that outcome is documented by tracking stations worldwide, and when data gets published or gets classified depending on what it shows and what implications institutions draw from results. Comes when we learn whether 3I Atlas continues on hyperbolic trajectory back into interstellar space, or whether it becomes permanent feature of Jupiter system as 96th moon that future observers will catalogue alongside Io and Europa and Ganymede and Callisto and all the others. If capture occurs, everything changes. Can't continue pretending this is just unusual comet when unusual comets don't get captured by planets they're passing. Can't maintain that natural processes explain everything when natural processes don't produce precision navigation and controlled deceleration required for orbital insertion. Can't avoid acknowledging that we've witnessed arrival of technology from beyond our solar system, even if we don't understand its origins or its purposes or its capabilities beyond what trajectory demonstrates. The evidence forces conclusion. The conclusion forces reckoning with implications. The implications force changes in how we think about ourselves and our cosmic context and our future. If capture doesn't occur, if 3I Atlas continues past Jupiter and heads back into interstellar space following trajectory that's consistent with hyperbolic flyby without orbital insertion, then questions remain but pressure eases. Then we can continue debating whether anomalies indicate technology or just indicate unusual natural object, without having to confront definitive demonstration of capabilities that natural objects don't possess. Then institutional preference for ambiguity and for continued study, and for avoiding conclusions that challenge comfortable assumptions gets reinforced. Then those who insisted technological interpretation was premature can claim vindication even though absence of capture doesn't prove object is natural any more than capture would prove it's artificial. But I'm not betting on the second scenario. I'm not expecting 3I Atlas to continue past Jupiter without being captured. The trajectory precision suggests planning. The timing synchronization suggests intent. The chemical signature suggests manufacturing. The velocity changes suggest propulsion, all pointing toward controlled arrival rather than random flyby, all consistent with mission that's approaching completion, rather than with natural object following gravitational dynamics through stellar system it entered by chance. The pattern is too clear, the evidence is too consistent, the convergence toward specific destination with specific timing is too precise to be coincidence, so I'm expecting capture, expecting that March 18th brings news that Jupiter has 96th moon, expecting that tracking data shows 3I Atlas in stable orbit around the planet rather than continuing on departure trajectory, expecting that predictions about rendezvous prove accurate and that object demonstrates exactly the capabilities that technological interpretation suggests it possesses. Expecting that we wake up in a universe that's different from the one we went to sleep in because we've confirmed we're not alone, and because silence has been broken, and because visitors are here. And I'm expecting institutional response to be inadequate. Expecting that official statements remain carefully neutral even when observations force conclusions. Expecting that classification increases rather than decreases as more sensitive data gets collected showing details that public isn't being told. Expecting that managed disclosure, if it occurs, will be slow and cautious and incomplete. Expecting that pressure builds as distributed observer networks document what's happening, and as amateur analysts interpret data that institutions won't comment on, and as public demands explanations that institutions aren't providing. That tension between what people can see for themselves and what official sources will acknowledge creates an environment where trust erodes, where institutional credibility suffers because refusing to address obvious questions makes institutions seem either incompetent or deceptive, where conspiracy theories flourish because absence of authoritative information creates vacuum that speculation fills, where social cohesion fractures as different groups develop incompatible narratives about what's happening and about what it means. All predictable consequences of managing information rather than sharing it, all avoidable through transparency, all likely to occur anyway because institutions default to secrecy when confronting situations they don't know how to handle. The sadness I mentioned earlier, the recognition of how much we've been kept in darkness, becomes sharper as March approaches and as realization grows that institutions knew more than they were saying, and that questions we were asking were legitimate even when they were dismissed as fringe or conspiratorial or unscientific. The sadness isn't just about lost time or about delayed understanding, it's about betrayal of trust. about recognition that sources we relied on for information about cosmos weren't reliable. We're filtering observations through priorities that weren't disclosed. We're serving interests that weren't ours. We're maintaining narratives that protected institutions rather than informing publics. Rebuilding that trust after it's been damaged requires transparency going forward, even when past secrecy was motivated by understandable concerns about security or stability or preventing panic. Requires acknowledging that mistakes were made, that information should have been shared sooner, that people deserved to know what was being observed and what it might mean rather than being protected from implications that they're capable of processing if given accurate information in appropriate context. Requires treating populations as adults who can handle difficult truths rather than as children who need shielding from reality. But I'm not optimistic that such transparency will emerge voluntarily. More likely it's forced by circumstances as observations that can't be hidden compel acknowledgement, and as distributed networks that institutions don't control publish analyses that official sources can no longer ignore. More likely disclosure is messy, is contested, is incomplete, is exactly what we're seeing play out in real time as March 17th approaches, and as different voices offer different interpretations, and as official silence becomes increasingly untenable. The cosmic ecology that 3i Atlas's arrival reveals or confirms is fundamentally different from empty void that human civilization developed within, is populated, is active, is environment where objects transit between stellar systems, not just randomly through natural ejection, but potentially deliberately through technology that enables navigation and propulsion. Is context where infrastructure might exist, where waypoints or stations or observation posts might be maintained by civilizations that achieved interstellar capability before us, where Earth might be known, might be catalogued, might be visited or monitored or incorporated into networks we don't perceive because we haven't developed technology to detect them, or because we haven't asked right questions when analysing data we collect. That's the universe we're waking up to. That's the reality that March 2026 might confirm. That's the paradigm shift that transforms everything from how we search for life to how we think about our future, to how we organise societies knowing we're not alone. It's a larger transition than any previous scientific revolution, because it's not just updating models about how nature works. Is updating understanding about our place in cosmic order, about whether we're unique or common, about whether we're isolated or observed, about whether we're pioneers or newcomers, about what futures are possible and what challenges we'll face and what opportunities might exist if we can navigate contact successfully. I don't know what March 17th brings. Don't know with certainty whether predictions prove correct or whether unexpected developments change the trajectory, or whether natural explanations emerge that account for everything without requiring technological interpretation. Don't know how institutions respond if capture occurs and if evidence becomes undeniable. Don't know how societies process the news or what changes it triggers, or whether humanity rises to occasion or fractures under stress of paradigm shift that challenges fundamental assumptions. But I know we're approaching threshold. Know that the days between now and March 17th are countdown to moment when predictions become testable, and when ambiguity potentially resolves into clarity. Know that the evidence accumulated so far suggests we're witnessing something extraordinary. Know that the silence that institutions maintain despite that evidence is itself revealing. Know that the attempt to keep us looking away from alligator in river isn't working, because too many people have seen the eyes and the movement and the teeth, and can't unsee them, no matter how often we're told it's just log. The river isn't empty. The void isn't silent. The cosmos is populated, and the visitors who've arrived are forcing us to acknowledge realities we've been avoiding. March 17th, 2026. Mark the date. Watch the telemetry. Document what happens. Be part of community that witnesses history rather than reading about it later in accounts that might be sanitized. Be present for moment when everything changes, or when everything stays same depending on what observations reveal and what conclusions can no longer be avoided. Until then we watch, we wait, we analyse, we prepare as best we can for outcomes we can't fully predict. We maintain curiosity while exercising critical judgment. We remain open while demanding evidence. We acknowledge uncertainty while following where data leads. We keep asking questions even when answers are uncomfortable. We refuse to look away even when looking means confronting implications that challenge everything we thought we knew. The alligator is here, is approaching its destination, is preparing for rendezvous that will either confirm its nature or will leave us with continued ambiguity, depending on what March brings. The teeth are about to be shown, the log interpretation is about to be tested, the void is about to speak clearly enough that silence can no longer be maintained. And we, humanity, civilization, species that thought it was alone, are about to learn whether that thought was correct or whether it was comfortable fiction that evidence is now dispelling. Stay curious. Keep watching the stars. Keep documenting what you observe. Keep sharing what you find. Keep building understanding collectively because institutional channels aren't providing what we need to make sense of what's happening. Keep questioning narratives that seem designed to maintain ambiguity, rather than to pursue truth. Keep pushing for transparency even when institutions resist. Keep demanding answers even when questions are dismissed as illegitimate. Because this matters more than anything else that's happening in our world right now if the implications are even partially what they appear to be. Matters for how we understand ourselves and our past and our future. Matters for what possibilities we consider and what preparations we make. Matters for whether we're ready for a universe that's more complex and more populated than comfortable isolation assumed. Matters for everything. The countdown to March 17th continues. The approach to Hill Sphere boundary proceeds. The rendezvous with Eupheme draws closer. The moment of truth approaches, and whatever that moment reveals, we'll be here documenting it, analysing it, trying to understand it, sharing what we learn with community that cares about these questions and that refuses to accept comfortable lies in place of uncomfortable truths. Until the alligator shows its teeth and until the void finally speaks clearly, and until silence breaks, and until we know for certain whether we're alone or whether we're surrounded by others who arrive before us, and who are watching to see how we respond to first contact that we didn't initiate and weren't prepared for, we continue the work. We observe, we analyse, we share, we question, we demand. We pursue truth regardless of where it leads or what it reveals about the universe we inhabit and about our place within it. Clear skies, and may March 17th bring clarity that silence has denied us.